activities. There are no co-pays or deductibles, and it's covered through Medicare and Medicaid. Providence Elder Place PACE works to keep you healthy and in your home. Call 206-320-5325 or visit providence.org Elder Place. Providence.org Elder Place.
You're listening to Rainier Avenue Radio World. I'm Granville Emerson along with my partner,
Ronald Pepe
Dean, and we host the show Lidline Sports right here on Rainier Avenue Radio World, where we talk about football, basketball,
local sports,
national sports, Seahawks,
UW,
Seattle U Redhawks,
Garfield Bulldogs,
all that and more right here on Lidline Sports on Rainier Avenue Radio World.
Different rules apply when it gets this late. You know what I mean? It's like after hours.
Whatever gets you through the night. It's all right.
Hello, I'm an unpaid spokesman for DJ Sotovaci. I'd like to invite you to listen to his free-form music show. It's popular music the way it was never intended to be heard. Whatever gets you through the night, late nights, here on Rainier Avenue Radio World.
Whatever gets you through the night.
Are you nerdy by nature? The Crosscut Ideas Festival is back with captivating conversations to quench your curiosity. Explore issues in science, health, culture, and politics with thought leaders and innovators like Ibram X. Kendi, Audie Cornish, Eric Holder, John Quillen Hill, Andrew Yang, and more. April 29th to May 6th at the Amazon Meeting Center in downtown Seattle. It's the Crosscut Ideas Festival, where curiosity and discovery connect. Get your tickets at crosscut.com/festival.
Rainier Avenue Radio World is your 24/7 digital media hub. Tune in at Rainier Avenue Radio World. Also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and TuneIn apps.
Welcome, everyone, to this beautiful theater, Columbia City Theater. It's a wonderful, wonderful venue, and we're here to celebrate Earth Deserves More Than a Day. I'm Sam Hampton. I'm the executive director of the Social Justice Film Institute and Film Festival. And joining me is from Front and Center, Aurora Martin.
Sam, everyone. And thank you out there online and who 5 days of celebration relating Earth Deserves More Than a Day. Yesterday, we had a youth radio takeover. We had a number of youth talk about what climate change means to them, what environmental justice means to them, and their hope for the future in spite of the urgency of today. Tonight, we have a very, very special film that is very much about local history and the inextricable link between people and place and climate change and environmental injustice. Tonight, we are screening the local film and documentary Promised Land, which features 2 tribes here in the Northwest region who have a continued fight over by 15 minutes with honorable tribal council members from the Duwamish Tribe. We will have their opinion about what it feels like waiting and waiting for, and what Earth Day, the lead up to Earth Day, Saturday, April 22nd, means to them as stewards of this land who are still waiting. So enjoy the show.
Three years, 2 months, and 9 days. That's all the time it took. From the time that the Denny party landed on Alki Point on November 13th, 1851, to the signing of the Point Elliott Treaty in 1855. 3 years, 2 months, and 9 days from the day my great-great-great-great-grandfather Chief Seattle said, Tlalil de Siaya, Tlalil Adisha Padate Alok Dawams, Gui de Siaya Adisha Pad. Come ashore, my friends. Come ashore onto this ancient land of the Duwamish. You are welcome here. 3 years, 2 months, and 9 days is all it took for the U.S. government to order the Duwamish people to leave their ancestral lands, the lands of their homes, the lands where their ancestors' bones lie in the ground, the lands they have come to live upon for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. 3 years, 2 months, and 9 days. That's all it took for the Duwamish to be forced onto reservations, to be ungrounded, or to even simply hide, doing these things just to survive. 10 years following the sign of the Point Elliott Treaty is all it took for Seattle leaders to pass Ordinance Number 5. Ordinance Number 5 stating that it was illegal for Indians to live and to remain in the city after dark. 3 years, 2 months, and 9 days to bury a culture, to bury the memory, to bury the wisdom of the people that lived here for thousands and thousands of years. 3 years, 2 months, and 9 days. The Duwamish still live. The hills, the creeks, the trees in the valleys still live. They remember the custodians of the land. 3 years, 2 months, and 9 days. The Duwamish remain. We are fixed to the land. We are still here, the Duwamish people. 3 years, 2 months, and 9 days. This is all the time it took for our world to change, to turn inside out and upside down. 3 years, 2 months, and 9 days. Ya Yustubs Tidsda at the Duwabs. I am Workman of the Duwamish Tribe.
The struggle for identity is not to regain it, but to be able to claim it openly. I know of no other racial group in the United States that has to prove who they are. Whatever a person claims to be, most folks just simply take them at their word. And yet, if you say you're American Indian, you've got to prove it.
Well, the treaty was in 1855, or the war was in 1876, or whatever. Why can't people just get over it? We live in the now, right? We don't live in the past. And I always want to ask people, what exactly is the it that you're wanting people to get over?
Tribes that are less powerful because they don't have the acknowledgement, because they don't have the government-to-government relationship, are the front line of a battle that is continuing for the very hearts and souls of American Indians who believe in tribal sovereignty. This affects all of us, and those that think it does not affect them will be affected by it eventually. There will be some regulation, there will be some action that will diminish them also if given enough time. And the only thing that I need to show to prove it is to look at the history of the United States in dealing with American Indian people. It is consistent, and it is not good.
The government has made it awfully hard on the Chinook people. Our families have continued to suffer.
We have a very great story to tell, and I think that we need to have people come forward and do things in the public eye that would uphold the Duwamish. I mean, after all, that our city is named after our chief, and that to me is really important, and that's really special because there's no other town named after an Indian. I mean, isn't that something special?
Recognition is an acknowledgement of the sovereignty of your tribal government, and that enables that government then to stand against the forces that are in its immediate surroundings that have been declaring that you don't exist.
And these are the people that fight, men and women. They fight for this recognition because we are not gone. We are still here.
It's important for people to not just focus on one story, but to know that there's many different stories. Now, we're definitely not the same at all, but we're all still in the same fight. We're all still fighting the same battles. And it's important for us to band together, you know, stand side by side and overcome together.
They say, well, where are your people? Well, the promise of the treaties was never given to our people. But I have to tell you that I'm so proud of the people who still hang in there and say, we're Duwamish. And I say to anybody, our people are still here. Even though you don't see them, we're still here.
As a Duwamish, I'm back on the river, drawn to the river. So when we look at this island behind us, this is on original Duwamish. And so just up from where we are, you can see an ancient village site or remnants of ancient village shells and all of that stuff. And so they're all still here. All the ancestors are still here in spite of all the industry that you see here behind us. The river still flows. The people are still here.
We're in the city of Seattle, which is one of the largest cities on the West Coast. We are a large freight portal and the major city in the state of Washington. And the Duwamish River is the industrial base for the city of Seattle. That's kind of the way the city looks at it. The Duwamish River is one of the main arteries in this area that the Duwamish tribe used. There was village sites on the Duwamish River, as well as in Elliott Bay, in Renton, and Lake Washington, all the way over to Lake Sammamish. And so when I talk about Western King County, that's where the Duwamish tribe was. So home is different. It's not just a place where you've lived for the last 10 years. It's a place where my people have been for almost 10,000 years. This is the place the Creator gave us. This is home. That's what home means to me. The myths that are up and down this river that talk about when the ice receded. North wind, south wind myth here is a very important thing, and it talks about when the ice receded here.
Jajus is work, Stobs is man, so Jajus Stobs tids da. My name is Workman. Atta duf Duwabs de Ishachad. I am of the Duwamish Tribe. Ufakwa yekwa, siabsi alchad, and great-great-great-great-grandson of Chief Seattle.
Chief Seattle was both Duwamish and Suquamish. His mother, Sholitza, was a highborn Duwamish from the little town of Stook, which is Renton today. And then his dad was full-blooded Suquamish. Our area here, we had everything we needed to survive on. We used the cedar because it had a buoyancy to it. And then you could split it and build the longhouses with it and make it where it's, which is good for everything. I mean, we used the tree limbs for the baskets, and we used it for, making all kinds of things. I feel that I must have a special, something special to share with those people, and I enjoy that, and I just keep weaving because I love to do it.
We are Indian. We have always known we were Indian. I've grown up being proud of my Indian heritage, and I'm told over and over, well, you're not a recognized tribe. Upsets me.
As far as I'm concerned and the tribe is concerned, we don't change who we are. We can't change who we are. So we just keep moving forward in how we can.
We aren't very far removed from a time when it was just Native people here. Today, people want to say, oh, this was so long ago, get over it, whatever it is. This is not our experience. In our experience, my dad's grandmother was born in 1886. You don't have to go very far back to a time when it was the Chinook people, the Wakayakum, the Kashlamet, the Clatsop, the Lower Chinook, the Willapa. When you think of it in a short time scale like that, my dad's always said it's the blink of an eye that non-natives have been here in our history.
So I am a descendant of Huxfeld, the last full chief of the Willapa tribe, and also a signature signer of the 1851 Tansy Point Treaty. And I'm the elected chairman of the Chinook Nation, which comprises the 5 tribes. And it's the combination of that that allows me the honor and privilege to speak on behalf of our people. This is the Willapa River, the river of my ancestors. That's a great privilege to be able to tell people that my family has never, ever left where we came from.
I'm a student of our elders. I'm a proponent for our rights and our history, relaying the words of our ancestors, hearing the stories of what was happening, because they were really working hard in my lifetime to establish real, genuine fishing rights for the tribe.
I come down from a Skull Welch, and a Skull Welch is my third great-grandfather. He was a treaty signer of the 1851 Tansy Point treaties. I guess there's stories to tell about each of these people.
There are a ton of Chinook still in Bay Center. There's a bunch still in Clatsop area. I mean, we're all still in Owaco, all these places, Longview. I was born in Longview, raised in Longview.
When we're traveling on these canoes, traveling down those villages like Skamakaway and down by Pillar Rock and, into the Willapa Bay Goose Point and all these other village sites, the ancestors are traveling with us. It's real obvious, and they're proud of us, so that we're continuing to battle. We just hope that someday that, we're going to be able to take care of our elders properly, get them some elder housing, get our youth education.
We do think that this is one of the more densely populated areas in native North America.
Comcomly was the premier, had started off being a second or third level chief, but was able to maneuver himself into being, certainly by 1800 or 1810, the principal chief on the Lower River.
Right behind me is a concrete replica of Chief Comcomly's grave. He was an important leader in a very important time during Chinook history. There was a lot of contact between British and American sailors and the Chinook people, especially with the Oregon Territory being extremely important to the outcome of the future United States of America. He was the one that everybody came to when they wanted to communicate with other tribes or other ships that were coming in.
And when McLaughlin came with American Fur Trade Company and Astor came with the Hudson Bay, before that, they actually called Comcomly their benefactor.
I'd say at one time when the Spanish was our first contact before the Europeans came, there was probably about 80 to 90,000 Chinook people. But unfortunately, the Spanish brought in smallpox, and so the population went down. Later on, as Lewis and Clark, or Clueless and Lark as I like to refer to them, because they came the wrong direction. All the other Europeans had been coming up the river for 3 decades. Lewis and Clark were coming down the river. You know, recently we've had elders that have passed away remember hearing stories about Lewis and Clark from their great-grandmother, when their great-grandmother was a child, you know, meeting them. So this is all recent history for us over here.
Lewis and Clark and their Corps of Discovery expedition set out to find the Pacific Waterway to the northwest. They've been traveling for a year and a half, almost 2 years now, and they're so close to their destination. They're actually right across the water here. And the weather had been so terrible, it was mid-November, that they had to stop for 3 weeks. They couldn't move. Comcomly and his Chinooks, you know, just stumbled upon them, cold, wet, hungry, exhausted. And they picked him up, took him to their village, took care of him.
It's really impossible to talk about the creation of Seattle, the founding of Seattle, without talking about Indigenous people, without talking about Indigenous labor, Indigenous knowledge, and by and large, that's from the Duwamish people. So from the beginning, it's they're completely inextricably linked. Siap, honorable person, upper class person, descended from important towns on both sides of the Sound, and would have had extensive oratory powers, skills of public speaking, which is understood as spiritual power. He had political acumen that allowed him to maintain connections between families, between communities, across a big chunk of central Puget Sound. So he was quite a powerful figure by all accounts, including by settler accounts. Virtually everything that happened in the founding of Seattle was made possible by Indigenous people, including Siak. So that first winter that the Denny Party spent at Alki Point, which is really a terrible place to spend the winter. It's very exposed. They brought other kinds of food and so on to that place to help the people survive the winter.
Settlers came in 1851. We met them at Alki. We're very peaceful people. We understand the story, said we tried to help them and continue to help them.
That Siak also played a role not just as a leader in his own community, but as something of a labor contractor to organize Native men as laborers in the sawmill. And if we look a couple years ahead into the founding of the town, of what became the city of Seattle, Native people played huge roles in that founding as laborers, you know, clearing the land, cutting down trees and shipping that lumber to San Francisco, women working in people's homes.
Even as the Duwamish were pushed off their land, denied the access to the hazelnut groves and the various beaches and rivers and places where they got food, they're starving. Some of them go off and work in sawmills, some of them intermarry, and so on. They try to survive.
There's a real range of perspectives that you see in the documents from early settlers in terms of their attitudes toward Native people. You have everything from outright murderous violence, and there are cases of that, you know, Native people being hanged on the front street of Seattle in the very first years, all the way to mixed race families. And in fact, in the 1860s and 70s, mixed race families were so common in the city that some of the more elite leaders in town saw this as a real problem. This was a bit of a PR issue for them, because the idea was, we're going to come out here and build a white community. And then visitors would come and they would see all these mixed race children, people speaking Lushootseed as well as Chinook jargon, and this was not the plan, right? So there becomes a real anxiety among city leaders to whiten the place up. And so you see this real range from kind of paternalism, oh, we'll take care of our Indians, to outright hatred, to love. It's a real mix of reactions to Native people. All of those, though, speak to the level of intimacy that people had. Important thing to remember about treaties is that treaties don't give rights to Native people. Treaties reserve rights on the part of Native people. That's a very important distinction, and a lot of people don't really understand that. I think a lot of people sense that the government was somehow giving Native people something by going through these treaties. But the treaties had a number of things that they reserved, and those included things like the rights to hunt and fish, rights to certain places, and things like schools, blacksmiths, things like this. These are really common parts of treaties all over the American West. Things that were supposed to be reserved and promised by the federal government.
When Anson Dart, who was the superintendent from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was sent out in 1851 to make our treaties, he was instructed by the president to make sure that all treaties, when they're signed, and this was, he was doing Oregon, California, Washington, and when all the treaties were signed, people were removed, the tribes were removed from where pioneers were.
The thing was, we had been interacting with settlers and pioneers in a positive way for a long time now, because that was just in our nature.
Chinookan people, ran all the way from the Dalles to the mouth of Columbia River, but when treaties came in and the treaties were being ratified, a lot of those upper river Chinookan people went to Yakima or Warm Springs. There was people that went to Grand Ronde, and then of course our 5 tribes in the Anson Dart Treaty were supposed to have a reservation as well, and that reservation was going to be the Willapa Bay, which would have been great for us.
1851, the Anson Dart treaties allowed us the ability to stay in the locations where we were living, basically in, an amalgamated village or two at the time, and allowed us access to resources. It was very important for our ancestors at the time, and continues to be important for us today, to be with the bones of our ancestors, to be on our Aboriginal land in our traditional places. And that's what was negotiated in 1851.
I know Anson Dart was in a hurry to get these treaties ratified because the president had realized that land was been given away for almost 3 years before they decided to do treaties with us, so that's illegal in the world doctrine. And therefore, it was kind of a rush, but the other reason I feel that the Anson Dart Treaty was not ratified is that it was taken back to the Senate in D.C. and unfortunately the Senate was told not to worry about the Chinook people, that we were so infected by malaria we'd be gone.
So they shelved the treaties, which is why those treaties were never ratified. In 1855, they realized that we hadn't all perished, so they sent out Territorial Governor Stevens for the 1855 Stevens treaties. Those treaties would have moved us off of the mouth of the Columbia River, off of the mouth of the Willapa River, and relocated us. And that was not acceptable to our people, so our people wouldn't sign, which is why we ended up with no treaty.
It wasn't going to be what we were telling them we wanted and what we were requesting, which was land on the south end of Willapa Bay. It was, you'll have to move north to the land of the Quinaults and the lower Chehalis and Chinook representatives were beside themselves on this issue. We were not going to do that. We were going to stay in our own territory, and it's what broke up that treaty negotiation.
On the last day of negotiations at the Chehalis River Treaty Council, Isaac Stevens cut it off. He said, "I'm leaving."
The fact that we had no treaty did not mean we weren't a tribe. It just meant we didn't have a treaty.
In 1864, the Secretary of the Interior wrote a document that said he was taking all of Southwest Washington. And clearly our tribal lands were in Oregon and they were taken the same way. But by the stroke of a pen, the Secretary of Interior took the land for the United States. And it is unconstitutional.
It was probably one of the richest areas, you know, at the end of the 19th century, you know, and then in the 20th century, and it'd be most, you know, economically depressed areas in the state.
The Chinook were given a choice, as I understand the history, of either relocating far upland, some of the far upriver tribes with whom they had a completely different way of life. Just imagine a coastal rainforest environment where you derive your living from the sea, from salmon fisheries, you build your homes out of the cedar trees, you make your clothing out of the cedar bark. That's your whole lifestyle. And you've lived there for the time immemorial as far as your people are concerned. Now you would be going upriver to where there are no cedar trees, the salmon run but far, far up, there are no crabs, there are no shellfish, the berries aren't there. Or you can move up coast to, at least in that case, it would have been a similar environment, I suppose. But it's different people, and you weren't just going to move, but you are going to become those people. So we're just going to tell you, the people you have always known and existed, and your culture, and your tribe, and your names, and your property are henceforth gone. You must go up and live with another people with whom you often competed in the past. And they will be making the rules for you. You lose your identity, you lose your property, you lose your rights, you lose your culture, you lose your history. Why not take that deal? That was the choice they were given. Or we will just proclaim that you're no longer an officially recognized tribe, and therefore you won't have any rights. And the Chinook people said, we're not taking your deal. If we accept your deal, we lose everything forever. If we deny, you can say we don't exist, but we still exist. We will continue to have our language. We will continue to have our culture. We will continue to have at least some of our property. We will continue to have our traditions, our own leadership, our tribal governance, our own way of life. That's what they chose, which is what almost every single American would choose for their own family.
We 100% believe we have these inherited rights. Nobody's extinguished our rights to the Aboriginal title of land or this ability to fish or hunt or gather in our own territory. It's become more and more difficult through time, but in my lifetime, we have been able to do these things as Indians, and I'm not going to be satisfied until, you know, I see that my kids have this right as well.
You know, we talk about rights, you know, there's so many rights that we don't have that's pathetic, you know. We don't have NAGPRA rights. We don't have the right to protect our ancestors that are buried, you know. We don't have there's so many rights we don't have, you know, and it's just sad, you know, not to be able to protect those thousands of folks that are on this river.
There is no question with any of the tribes here in the area that there is a Duwamish tribe. There has been a Duwamish tribe. The first signature on the Point Elliott Treaty, which is the treaty that most tribes in Puget Sound are part of, is Chief Seattle, and he's signed as the Duwamish Suquamish chief. 5 other signatures were of Duwamish headmen of their villages, and they're signed that way. The Indian agent that was out here made a petition to the federal government that said the Duwamish tribe needs to have a reservation here, you know, because they're not going anywhere. And so that was supposed to be down in Tukwila, at a place called Fort Dent.
It wasn't a large reservation by any means, but it was proposed, and there is a document that sort of shows where it would be. But in 1866, virtually every white man in King County signed a petition against the reservation. So it was never ratified by Congress.
What that petition said is that this land is too valuable for Indian people. We can't have an Indian reservation anywhere close to us.
Duwamish means the people of the inside, which means we lived on all the waterways. And we lived in longhouses. And the way that they tried to get rid of us is to burn down our homes.
The last longhouses for the Duwamish people that were here were burned to the ground. And burned to the ground because this was, you know, they were just starting to open up this area for real estate development. And in those days, you could not do real estate development if there's still Indian people there, because people don't want to live next to Indian people.
They kept pushing us off of our Duwamish River and the other rivers that were there, the Cedar and all that. And when we were downtown, there was no place else for us to go except onto an island that was made by the ballast out of the sailing ships.
And Ballast Island would be where the tall ships had come into Puget Sound to pick up all of these trees that were being harvested. They would offload their ballast rocks in Elliott Bay. And eventually this built up this big rock place called Ballast Island, and the Duwamish were given that to live on, just a bunch of rocks in the middle of the bay. Those rocks eventually became so valuable that they were kicked off, they being my tribe, Tahitian, off of Ballast Island. Nowhere could the Duwamish live.
As a matter of fact, there were actually other laws that said, you know, Indian people couldn't be in the city of Seattle after dark. Indian people, if you were working in the city of Seattle, you had to have a place for them to be and to go after dark so that they wouldn't be amongst the population.
When you have people who are still living on the land in traditional ways or doing their best to do that, if you transform the landscape utterly, that's going to cause all kinds of chaos in that community. And so that seems to be the crux in some ways of the recognition question. It comes down to environmental change. This is the same decade when the Duwamish River is being channelized and straightened, and there are literally Native people dying, starving to death within sight of downtown in the 19-teens. So this is the reality for Duwamish people during that era.
They created these reservations for Indians to get away from where the settlers are coming from the East Coast. So, but they forgot to make sure that there was enough homes or places and food. And our people did not survive, so they just came back to their Aboriginal, their traditional places, and still lived here. They still survived in the woods.
There were originally 4 rivers that came into the Duwamish: the Black, the Cedar, the Green, and the White. With the lowering of Lake Washington, which was part of the Lake Washington Ship Canal process, the Black River ceased to exist. And this is where a large number of Duwamish people were actually living at the time.
There was about 6 longhouses at that time. Well, they lived along the water. Well, the water dried up and it killed that village.
The Black River ceased to exist in the course of about a day. And there was just sort of pools left, and the holes at the bottom of the river where you would fish, those were sort of left as pools with fish in them. And there's a story of settlers going out and kind of having a party and walking out onto the riverbed with burlap sacks and just picking up the fish and taking them away, and the sense that it was a party.
And so the people that were living here no longer had access to their food source. And so this was the last vestige of the Duwamish tribe, was right here on the Black River. There was 100 or so of them, and that would be around the year of, well, 1916, and that would be 100 years ago. We're almost at the centennial. I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about that.
Behind me is Kellogg Island. That's the current name of the island. A long time ago, it was known as Mud Island. And Mud Island actually stretched from where this island is here about another 5 miles over to Beacon Hill. It was one of the largest mudflats on the West Coast. This is where we used to gather. The city of Seattle, late 1800s, early 1900s, knew it needed to have an industrial area to really be a thriving city. And this was the place that was designated for that. And so they brought in dirt and garbage and anything else that they could find to fill this area in. And through all of that, that's where we have now the industrial area that's down here. In a lot of places, we don't even know what's down there. Rubbish from the San Francisco earthquake wound up here.
Right behind me, we're literally looking at the Duwamish homelands. And so, if you were a tribe in a more remote area, the impact of those treaties was more gradual. But, what's behind me is literally the Duwamish River and the tidelands that are associated with that. We have a football stadium and a baseball stadium in the tidelands that were inhabited by the Duwamish tribe.
We are a river people. This is where we come from. This is our place. And, it's been damaged, just like Duwamish people have been damaged.
The Duwamish had real challenges that they faced by not having a reservation and by being located in a place that was going to become a city. And this is true, I think, for any Native community that owns a territory that becomes a city. It's very difficult for those kinds of communities to hold on to land. And so by the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s, you see Duwamish people still living in their traditional territory, but usually at the edges. The urban fabric gets tighter and tighter and tighter, and so there are fewer and fewer spaces for Native people to live if they want to live in traditional ways.
To be literally at ground zero of the impact of Western expansion is a unique burden that the Duwamish faced. Because Seattle has been the center of that impact. These are rights that are reserved by the Duwamish tribe. They're not rights granted to them by the United States. So, in other words, the Duwamish were the sovereigns of this land, and they entered into a treaty with another sovereign where the Duwamish reserved rights to themselves in perpetuity.
The relationship between the federal government and the American Indian tribes is spelled out in the Constitution. And it doesn't say federal tribes are acknowledged. It doesn't, that certain tribes are acknowledged. It just says the American Indian tribes, right in the Commerce Clause. The way that the clause reads, at least from my perspective, is that there's an understanding that there are these nations around us that we are living among, and that it is the federal government that will have direct communication and dealings with these other sovereigns. And it's important to understand that that is the basis of the relationship. It is an acknowledgement of inherent sovereignty.
The recognition process is not a gift to Indian tribes. It is a solemn duty of the United States government.
Therefore, any tribe that gets through the process, sovereignty isn't being bestowed, it's merely being acknowledged. It's a sovereignty that existed, which means that it's a correction in the relationship of the federal government with that tribe. The federal government neglected to do its job. Federal acknowledgement is the process of trying to correct those years and generations of injustice and neglect.
The process for recognition is a many multi-year process. It's where angels fear to tread in many cases.
There are 4 avenues for treaty signatory tribes like the Chinook, like Chief Seattle's Duwamish Tribe of Indians, to achieve restoration of the federal recognition that we most certainly had at the time of treaty signing. The first is by executive order of the President of the United States. The second is through the courts, through a lawsuit. This was the avenue by which the Samish tribe was restored.
And of course the Samish case became very interesting, and eventually they received recognition, but not until they twice had to find contempt of court against people in the Department of the Interior around colluding against them.
The third is through act of Congress, and the fourth is through the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the Interior Department.
A tribe that was seeking recognition would file a petition with evidence. The Department of Interior would review that evidence, make a preliminary determination either in favor of the tribe or against the tribe. Then there was another opportunity for the tribe to remedy those deficiencies and then reach a final decision.
Anything that prevents historic tribes from enjoying the government-to-government relationship that they deserve and should have, and actually does exist but is being denied by the federal government, is a form of termination.
There is the political elements. There will be many times attacks on the integrity of the people, on individuals, on the motivations, and so you have to have very tough skin to go through the process. The strength of your ancestors and your own belief in your identity really is what sustains people, I think, through that process.
The intent of that process was not to be a block or a gate to prevent tribes from getting in, but actually to assist worthy tribes, to assist historic communities, to gain the acknowledgement that they were due. And since that time, it has been twisted to becoming a stumbling block, a process that uses draconian tactics, irrational tactics, to prevent tribes from getting through. It is almost as though the goal of the process is to stop tribes from being acknowledged as opposed to assist them. So much so that the last two tribes to successfully navigate the process and be listed required 3 decades of work, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, millions, and I would dare say tens of millions of dollars, knowing the tribal leaders in those communities, and the intervention of the federal courts. Something has gone wrong since 1978.
The Duwamish tribe is one of the first tribes in the state of Washington to adopt a modern council, Robert's Rules of Order, and everything else, because they knew they needed that to be interacting with anybody outside of tribal liaisons, which they did. They were on the forefront for a lot of tribes here in Western Washington, and also on the forefront of treaty rights, going back to the 1960s and 1970s.
And all my memories, as far back as I can remember, are people getting together as a tribe. I have a copy of a constitution from 1925 that a group of people got together to write, and it's the Constitution of the Duwamish Tribe.
NCAI determined many years ago that something was wrong. And it was around the same time that actually federal studies were showing something was wrong with the process, that out of the estimated 200 or so tribes that were targeted to be reviewed for federal acknowledgement, only 17 had gotten through the process since 1978. And many more had been turned down, turned away. The process had become so expensive, prohibitive, invasive, humiliating, dehumanizing to a certain extent, that many worthy tribes were to a point that they didn't feel that they could go through the process because they could not afford the representation.
We've found records of congressional hearings in 1917 and thereabouts, where the Duwamish were traveling back to Washington, testifying before congressional committees. And those are the most important kinds of records, and they speak really to the Duwamish as a political entity asserting their rights as a tribe.
Studies were done in the early 70s dealing with the fact that many historic tribes, communities that had continued from contact, were not acknowledged, were not being served, were underserved, and were some of the most underserved Native communities in the country.
And at that time, all the tribes were involved fighting for their right to fish in all the waters in the Puget Sound. My brother approached me in '74. He was fishing in the Duwamish River, and he came to my house, and he was being cited by the Department of Fisheries for fishing in the Duwamish River. This one particular day, he said, you need to get involved. And I said, well, what do I have to do? He said, oh, just go to a few meetings. And so I start working with the former chair, which was Willard Bill. And then I was formally elected the chair in 1975. In the meanwhile, we lost the right to fish. So we naively believed, well, we'll just write a petition to the government and we'll get our status back. So we wrote a formal letter back to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it was returned to us. In the meanwhile, we didn't know that the federal government was setting up rules for recognition across the country. So we began that process to prove who we are as a tribe.
The Department Branch of Acknowledgement Research is a very narrow fact-finding body. They are not necessarily a policy-making body, and so their job is to make recommendations to the Assistant Secretary's office, and then the Assistant Secretary makes the judgments based on all the facts that are presented on whether a tribe should be recognized. And so the real decision maker in these matters is the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs.
They were submitting their petitions in the 1980s. In the 1990s, literally the last day of the Clinton administration, there was a document signed by the Department of Interior that recognized the Duwamish tribe.
The Undersecretary of the Interior called the tribal office and said, I'm signing off on the recognition of the Duwamish tribe in my office, and there was all kinds of people in his office at that time, people that worked on it and everything else. I just wanted you to know that that's what's happening right now here in Washington, D.C., is that this is one of the last things that we needed to get done, and we're getting it done before the administration is done.
I was only sitting in the office by myself. We have decided to recognize you. And Cindy, she came in about after they said they just recognized us. So then we spread the word and everybody showed up. We were very, very happy that happened after all those years.
At the end of the administration, when I made a decision to recognize the tribe, I felt that there was a substantial reasons for the tribe to be recognized based on law, evidence, facts.
It floored us. We didn't have any idea it was going to happen at that time. For a weekend, we were recognized.
All the documents were signed that were necessary to recognize the tribe. Later, that was challenged on the grounds that there was a couple of documents that were ministerial that were not properly signed, while not reflecting on the actual decision, were seized upon by opponents of the Duwamish to say that it was not a proper recognition.
The very first thing that the George Bush administration did was to put on hold any executive action that happened by the Clinton administration within the last 6 months to the end of his administration.
The fact that some documents weren't signed, even though ministerial, were seized on by opponents to say that the decision was not final. In my view, and as I've presented testimony to Congress, that was a final decision, and the tribe really at that point should have been recognized as an official Indian tribe.
Well, in the process, you can go through the administrative review regarding this decision. They didn't want to review it, so they just said the decision holds. You're not recognized by the federal government.
And then our attorneys, who had been working with us for a long time, said you have two options. Now, you can go to court, which you have standing to do, or you can try to get a bill through Congress. And bill through Congress is going to be a lot less expensive than a court case. So for about 5 years, we worked on trying to get a bill through Congress. Our local congressman, Jim McDermott, has been very good at trying to get that bill through.
I put these bills in because it's a matter of justice. There is a question of why, after all these years, the Duwamish have never been recognized. There are other tribes as well who've traveled the same road trying to get themselves recognized as a tribe. And the particular interest in Seattle, of course, is that Chief South was Duwamish.
One time they stated that we had 2 years that fell off the scope of history. And as you know, Native Americans a long time ago did not write stories or write books or write about their history. What they did is the way the Indians do things, that they tell stories, and you have to listen to what, hopefully you'll listen to what the elders are saying to you, and you keep it in mind, pass it on, and that's how they recorded the history.
This is not unique to the Duwamish, but many tribes across this entire land faced this struggle, that there weren't any written records, the governance wasn't as described by European law.
One of the issues that we have found is that the interpretation of material that has been submitted to the Office of Federal Acknowledgement in the past often was not viewed within the context of the history of the petitioning community. It was as though the office had a cookie-cutter understanding of how all tribes should be able to check off all these boxes in the same way. Well, because different communities went through different types of history, were impacted in different ways, had different strategies for survival, doesn't negate their legitimacy or the worthiness of their being acknowledged by the federal government.
It's like, how do you prove your existence in the 1800s? It was all oral tradition. We didn't take notes. But they're saying, well, you don't have anything to prove you were there. Well, no, that's not who we were. They'll use the fact that you don't have a communal base. It's like, well, no, you took our property. How can we have a communal base? They come up with things that are so absurd as saying people don't recognize or acknowledge that the Chinook exist. And my response to that is always, did you do this survey in the Bronx? Because pretty much anywhere you go, people know the name Chinook.
And they said we had some gaps in the 20s, you know, or before the 30s, between the 20s and the 30s. And it's like, well, what are you talking about gaps? It was illegal for 3 Indians to stand in the street and talk to each other, let alone have meetings or be politically, you know, savvy, you know. So we'd have to break the law to fill these gaps.
The whole excuse of us not being federally recognized was because we're not federally recognized. Mm-hmm. And so we need to find, you know, that path needs to stop where you say, okay, we did something wrong. You know, we really screwed up. You guys obviously aren't all gone since there's 3,000 of you. Yeah. And we need to go ahead and right this wrong and just make you federally recognized.
And you kind of have that back and forth where, all right, in 1863, they said, we're done making treaties with tribes. Tribes no longer exist. And then in 1934, they said, all right, we were wrong before. Now tribes do exist. The Indian Reorganization Act. Here's all your tribes, all your communities. You guys will get these benefits because of what happened. And then in 1954, with the Western Oregon Termination Act, you see again they're saying, no, we're going to get rid of these communities, get rid of these tribes that, you know, have been established already, because if they weren't established, then they wouldn't be able to name them in the Termination Act. And so again, they're saying, no, you're no longer tribes.
1978 is when the federal government got this new recognition process for tribes. And we thought we could clarify our status by you know, going through that process. So the tribe embarked on this huge project, and in all, it took 23 years to work through that.
It wasn't until 2001 before we got our recognition taken care of. And even along the way, it was a bumpy trail.
Near the end, after compiling, you know, tens of thousands of pages of documentation, we got the phone call. I got a phone call when I was in Portland, and they told us to immediately, you know, within like a week, to get our council come to Washington, D.C.
I literally finished the vote and ran to catch a cab, raced down to the ceremony, and was there when they celebrated their recognition. It was one of the last official acts of the Clinton administration. And I thought, how wonderful is this? Our country has righted a historic wrong. We have restored fairness and justice to a long-deprived people. And we've done it in a very constructive way. It was a joyful, proud day for me as a member of Congress. Our country had done the right thing.
It was a very, very, very happy day. You know, we were happy to have our council back there to witness this signing, and people coming down from the Senate and the House to witness this signing, you know. But it was short-lived. It was definitely short-lived.
With different people in power, you know, then we got the ruling against us.
By questioning the criteria, they held it up long enough to get it into the Bush administration.
Gary Johnson, who had been our chairman for many years, he had been at the White House at a Lewis and Clark kickoff dinner.
And the East Room of the White House was filled with all the tribes, all the recognized tribes that were along the Lewis and Clark Trail. So we had our big luncheon. We presented the president with gifts. My wife, Christy, and I were the two people there representing, I was representing Chinook. At the end of the workday, someone, perhaps a lower level person in the office, picked up the phone and gave us a call. It wasn't any of the officials that we had worked with.
The call was that they turned us down.
But it was, you know, obviously an incredible blow to the tribe.
And of course, the feeling with the tribe, you know, after that was, you know, I mean, it's a roller coaster ride. You're up, you're down, you're up, you're down. We kind of sat around wondering, what are we going to do? You know, where do we go from here? You know, to have it in your hands and be preparing for a celebration. And then to have it yanked out was terrible.
So it was kind of a tough way to get that ruling. You know, when you're a guest of the president.
Imagine that you're told one day as a human being that your people who've long suffered have at last achieved a lifetime dream. A dream that's fair and just. And then, not long after that, after the celebration, after the huge sigh of relief, after the elders have achieved what they've hoped for lifetimes, and lifetimes before that, now some new administration comes in and takes that away, and then says, and you don't get a second chance. The BIA insisted that they could not, as an agency, overturn their own already overturned decision. But the Congress had the discretionary authority. We make the laws, actually. That's the Constitution, happily. And that we had an opportunity to do that.
We are a nonprofit organization that runs on a very small, tiny budget that is smaller than the median household income in Washington state. And we service 3,000 people with this. So, you know, we don't have the resources. We don't even have the resources to go to court, because we could have gone to court to appeal this, but we didn't have $200,000 to where we could go to court and fight, you know, the reconsideration of final determination.
Then I resolved that one of my top priorities during my entire time of Congress would be to right this wrong. Because it is a wrong, and it's unjust, and it's a stain on American history, and it's a stain on American present today, this very day.
We hired our first lawyers in 1899. It was 1912 that we had a small settlement of money to try to address one of the 5 treaties that we have. Then it's 1925 that you have the right to sue the federal government. Then it's 1958 that we actually have a lawsuit before the Indian Court of Claims. Then it's 1970 before that one resolves itself. It's the end of the 70s that this new BIA process is put in place, and it's in the year 2001 that one resolves itself. This is too much. You know, we are watching our people die, and die in mass, in between the starting and ending of these processes that ultimately have got us nowhere. This has to stop.
I made my first trip to Washington, D.C. a year after being on council. Have been going back ever since, dealing with members of Congress, the Senate, not only in D.C., but here when they're home, dealing with state legislators, state senators, county commissioners, city administrators, and helping to draft bills that have actually been heard by Congress on our behalf, as well as the Duwamish and the Snohomish and the Stilichum, because it's one of the things that I firmly believe in. All of us are dealing with the same issues, so we all need to be working together. So if one of us has the opportunity to have a voice somewhere, we need to be the voice for everyone.
Delay is consequential, and delay is consequential legally, emotionally, for these people who feel they have an obligation to their ancestors in a way that many of us don't have that sort of ancestral commitment, but is heartfelt and deep and profound for the Chinook people. So when delay happens, people pass on with extraordinarily important unfinished business.
If I had to say what keeps me going on behalf of our people, you don't have enough time. But the short of it is, for me to do anything less than what I'm capable of doing to honor all of the people that came before me, that fought all the battles, fought all the struggles to have their land taken away, to being subjected to being the keeper of the river, to come back at the next fishing season and find canneries built, and they had to scavenge carcasses of fish under the cannery to survive. So for me to not do everything within my power would be to dishonor all of our people.
For American Indians, it is not enough to simply have a culture club. One of the things that I constantly hear is a critique of, you don't need federal acknowledgement, you can celebrate who you are without it. They don't understand, first off, we never chose to give up our governments. We're not immigrants. Secondly, our tribal identity is a part of who we are. And within our culture, governing ourselves and maintaining our traditions, which are often attacked, and until the mid-70s, in many instances, were illegal to practice, and in some ways still are, based on whether you have certain protections and privileges because you're listed with the BIA, that is something that only a tribe that has a certain level of acknowledgement can afford protections for its people. We struggle. I'm a tribal leader. I struggle to defend my people's right to have access to certain things, to make certain claims about our own history and who we are, to have our stories cherished and acknowledged. The measure of what a tribe is, sadly, in the minds of many Americans, is whether the United States says it is.
When the Port of Seattle was doing construction projects years ago, they unearthed a number of artifacts that date to the Duwamish occupation of this area. And for years, those resided with the Duwamish tribe, and after the Longhouse was built, a number of them were on display there, and probably so. As the port decided that they wanted a different arrangement, the Duwamish didn't have the legal standing to be the permanent custodians of that in the eyes of the port. That would not have happened had the Duwamish been a legally recognized tribe.
In the late 60s and early 70s, there was a neighborhood that was actually here. And the port came in and condemned it all because they were going to build this big facility here, which would have gone all the way out to the end of Kellogg Island and would have been completely paved and would have been a container port or something like that, because that's what the port does. As they were clearing the houses that were there, we were notified by an anonymous source that they were running into archaeology. And our tribal chair, Cecile Hansen, came out to the site, and some of our council people came out to the site, and we saw what they were talking about. And what happened is that the Port of Seattle actually started bulldozing even faster. Cecile stood in front of bulldozers to stop them while we were waiting for the University of Washington and the Corps of Engineers to get here to identify it as an archaeological site. As soon as it's identified as an archaeological site, work has to stop.
And as a result, we end up today with a park across the street from where the current Duwamish Longhouse resides. And this longhouse resides on ancient land called A'apus.
Because of the importance of this park and for its habitat and all kinds of other reasons, it was our ancestors that reached up and stopped the development, because they're the only ones that could have done it at that time.
Zizalalich is right down here today. Zizalalich is an Indian village that's right down by our ferry terminals. It's right down by what we call the big bore or Bertha. This great big earth boring machine is now stopped. It stopped right near the village of Zizalalich. So all of that stuff, when I say our ancestors are here, they're here. They're all over the place.
They literally don't even have the legal status to be able to be custodians of their own physical remains.
So we become recognized. That treaty comes back into law, and that means that the federal government has to do those things. Now, that would be an exciting thing. It would be a very exciting thing. It also would give us standing at the table for anything that happens down here. Right now, the Duwamish Tribe is part of our coalition with the RCC, which gives them a place at the table. But it's not the same as Muckleshoot or Suquamish, who have a real place at the table just for them, because they have a special relationship with EPA. The Superfund site on the river now is because of 100 years of industrial waste that have been dumped into the rivers and are in the sediments. So the whole idea today is to remove the polluted sediments from the river. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was the industries that were the biggest polluters down here. Today, it's everybody. And so that creates a whole new problem. What do you do about that? And we're working within the communities to make the communities all along in the watershed understand that whatever goes down that drain is going to come into the river. When I look at it as a tribal member, it's without a river, there isn't a people, and without a people, there isn't a river.
We're not grouped together like you would think people are grouped together in these tight pieces of land called reservations. So we make a living. We look just like you and I. We go out and we get jobs. We have families. We own houses. We come together once a year at our longhouse, which is on West Marginal Way, 4705 West Marginal Way. So we still come together. We sing our songs, and then we go out. And in ancient times, we would go out and we would pull camas. We would pull berries, blackberries, all kinds of foods. And we'd get ready for the winter. Well, we still do that today. We gather at the longhouse once a year, and then we go out and we have jobs. So in a very real sense, this is what a modern Native American looks like.
Kathapotl is a large Chinookan village located on what is now the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Ridgefield Wildlife Refuge. near Richfield, Washington.
Right in strategically placed at the intersection of all these waterways, you know, all these highways for Chinook people.
And in other fur trade era accounts, the site is mentioned. People stopped at Cathapodal, so it played a role in the fur trade in the area.
Lewis and Clark wrote about it, and they visited it, and they said that it had 900 people living in 14 houses, and 2 of the houses were 50 feet wide and 200 feet long, just huge houses.
Ian and Raymond, the Fish and Wildlife archaeologists, took the stance that even though the Chinook were not recognized, we would treat them as though, in our process and our work, we would treat them as though they were recognized.
That relationship with Dr. Ames, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where the village site there is located, led to the recreation of a Chinook house.
We built the house and to be a replica, and we blessed the site, we blessed the house, you know, and then eventually the house, right away the house was not a replica. It was the most modern of Chinook houses. It's a house that we use for winter gatherings, our ceremonies. And we just like our canoes and everything else, just like our ancestors believed, you know, we feel that the house has a soul. You know, the house needs to be taken care of. The house needs to have fires lit in it, you know, so we do that today, and we bring that house to life.
People do suggest that, oh, what's the cost to the country? What's the cost to the government? What I would say is, what's been the benefit to this country and the government for acquiring our lands without any payment, without any consideration at all for the Aboriginal people here?
It's across the United States where the government promised these things in trade for millions of acres that tribes gave and paid for in advance for the services the tribes are supposed to be getting now. And when the government is reneging on those, they are not keeping up their legally binding agreements with tribal nations here in the United States. And that should be considered just as much a violation as if they were not keeping an agreement with Mexico or Canada, their neighbors. So for people to think that tribes are trying to milk the government or be dependent on the government, it's a lack of awareness that they have considering the treaties and, again, the millions of acres that tribes gave.
You know, how much wealth has come in terms of resources from the water here, from the hills, from our mudflats. You know, it's tremendous. And the cost associated with recognizing the Chinook Indian Nation is a fraction of the amount of money that have been extracted or has been extracted from this territory.
We are survivors, and we are trying to keep the government accountable to what they've committed to. So there you have the division that the government has created again, and the concerning scarcity. You know, is there going to be enough? That's always the question, is there going to be enough? And then change is a challenge, and there's the fear of what will be taken away.
So the political climate towards not just the Chinook, but tribes from here to the East Coast, from Canada to Mexico, is the same. You go back there, and for lack of a better way to term, you get a lot of lip service. Mm-hmm. You get back there, you tell them your story, and they sympathize with you. But then when you try and get them to do something, they're very reluctant to do it, which is frustrating. It can get aggravating, but you just have to continue through that.
If you look around the world, various government entities have used different sorts of definitions to erase and extinguish or fail to recognize Aboriginal communities. There's no trait list whereby you can identify who Aboriginal people are. And if you do that, you inherently extinguish some, and you miss some, and you disqualify some. We're now in a period around the world where Indigenous populations are increasing rapidly in relation to other populations. And historically, they were pushed into areas that weren't profitable, into mountains. And some of those areas are now places where resource extraction is hoped for. Industry wants to go now into those marginal areas where Indigenous peoples were pushed a century or 2 centuries ago. And so it's inconvenient to have those people.
The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is an important document. It's a goal of all nations and signatories across the world to basically promote the self-determination of Native peoples. And so Indigenous peoples, whether it's in South America or North America or elsewhere, all have this document that the world leaders have signed on to promote self-determination.
This is our place in the world. The United Nations said Indigenous people have a right to exist in their territory. They have a right to access the resources, even profit from the resources of their own Aboriginal territory.
And so it's a worldwide movement, and it's something that, while aspirational, is something that sometimes actually results in real-life decision-making and also real-life recognition of tribes.
Well, all over the world are Aboriginal people, are people who potentially are Aboriginal people. Some communities don't want to be Aboriginal people. Historically, some communities hid their Aboriginality because they became the subjects of discrimination or violence.
Those of us who remained in many of our ancient ancestral areas remained under hostile governments, remained where states wanted to undo any entanglements with tribes that had been the possessors of the lands that they now claimed. And so they changed what the definition of Indian was. For example, in Delaware, which is where many of our people are, from my tribe, the definition of Indian changed a few times. It, at one point, was a person who was living in the woods and primarily ate deer meat. That became the legal definition of Indian. So my ancestors, who had been converted to Christianity, perhaps were living in European-style homes, even though they maintained their communities, and we can prove this, raised chickens and enjoyed pork chops, suddenly legally they weren't Indians. Another way that Indians' identity was changed is that for many you could not be both Indian and Christian. These were two different things. That you might legally kind of be called a praying Indian, but when you became a Christian and took up residence and went to a church and you were baptized, you ceased to be an Indian and you became a mulatto or a free person of color. And these terms didn't necessarily mean that you had a particular ancestry, either white or black plus Indian, but it just was a catch-all because you could no longer be viewed as an Indian because now you were baptized as a Christian. So in many ways, you see that there's this administrative change of the references of people. No longer were they called by the tribal name, they were called by some nickname that was imposed, maybe for the area that they lived in. And in the changing of those names, those identifiers, in official records, it was a form of administrative genocide, where these communities were no longer viewed as Indian by the states in which they lived. And the reason that they did not actively fight that is we have to remember that in the early 1800s, it became illegal to be Indian east of the Mississippi for many areas in this country. It was legal to shoot Indians if they were, not where they were supposed to be by definition of the local authorities of the state. So we wound up being lost to the pages of history. And our communities, even though they can be identified as continuing and the family names repeat and we see who they were, and maybe prior to a certain time they were called Indians and now suddenly they're not anymore, it's a form of writing us off, of saying that we're extinct. We've gone the way of the dinosaurs. in certain regions of the country, apparently, simply because someone used the power of a pen to erase us.
I went with a group of native people of the Fraser River to Papua New Guinea, to a community there, living on southeast Papua New Guinea in Aurora province. And they didn't really, the concept of being indigenous or Aboriginal was one that they didn't know about really. But all over the world are non-recognized people. The one estimate in the US at one point was that there was 250,000 people who are members of non-recognized tribes.
The federal government is increasingly, in various ways, in small ways, changing the definition of what it means to be Indian, so that many of the regulations that used to include all American Indians suddenly now are including only federally recognized American Indians. And there was recently a Supreme Court decision that further divided Indian country between those that were recognized during the era of the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934 and those that were subsequently recognized. The federal government takes small steps to slowly subdue and reduce our sovereignty. And for those tribes that don't immediately feel affected, they often, sadly, will act as though it's not really an issue, and if you were really who you say you were, you wouldn't have this problem. And then what they don't realize is the ground is being swallowed up from under them, bit by bit.
One of the big problems for Native peoples, Aboriginal peoples of North America is even for recognized tribes, is the ways in which they're understood to be such. And one of the ideas that came in the late 19th century, in particular in the US, and has snuck into Canadian thinking, even though in theory it isn't part of it, is the idea of blood quantum, the percentage of blood from ancestors. And the problem is, there's two things. One is the blood quantum from your own tribe is one, and the other is blood quantum from Native people generally.
And as you know, across the nation, tribes are beginning to realize that blood quantum is a really dumb way just to determine, you know, if you're an Indian or not, because of the fact that, of course, your children are going to marry somebody else, and, you know, as we all become, our world becomes smaller.
It's really a threat to Native North America, because it means, with gradual diminution of that throughout marriage and so forth, it means that many descendants will not be able to claim recognition as individuals, and possibly tribes will shrink, and some tribes may disappear entirely. It's a real horrible threat.
If we talk about sort of identity, everyone knows that, you know, Chief Seattle was both Duwamish and Suquamish. You know, he had a parent from one tribe, parent from the other tribe, and that wasn't unusual, you know, prior to treaty time.
In ancient times, you became part of the tribe if somebody extended their loving arms around you and made you part of their family, and then you were part of the tribe. In more modern times, because of the regulations imposed by the federal government upon a racial standard that is alien to us, the concept of blood quantum has arisen.
So clearly, you know, the geographic boundaries, the cultural boundaries of those tribes had flexibility. And, you know, part of what's going on here is you have the United States trying to impose, for purposes of their negotiations and for purposes of treaties, sort of rigid boundaries. Clearly, it was in the interest of the United States to compartmentalize people, to try to reduce the number of independent sovereign entities that existed.
The blood quantum standard becomes something that is a strengthening point. It's like trying to hold on to a sharp knife by grabbing it by the blade and trying not to get cut. My tribe is a blood quantum tribe. And the reason it's a blood quantum tribe is partially because it enables us to stand against so many of the federal tribes who say we are not who we claim to be. However, as a tribal leader, I know that within my own tribal council and within the other councils within our confederation, it is an issue, because ultimately, none of us in future generations will be able to maintain that level of blood quantum. I'm aware of small communities where they can't maintain it without putting themselves in jeopardy health-wise. So it is a challenge. It's a double-edged sword. Hopefully one day it'll be unnecessary. But that's been imposed, and in some senses, for some communities, it becomes a necessary evil so that they can better preserve their identity in the face of those who claim they're not who they say they are.
It's even a topic beyond itself. It's really a topic about how we recognize people, how the state operates, how relations should be. So it's interesting. If you look at the most insecure of all groups to see their circumstances, it's maybe the best way to look at how we should try to look at the future.
So many people don't know what's happening. They don't know that history is repeating itself in small ways across the country, that the indigenous people in this land are losing ground, having their rights denied, are suffering through overt racism, are dealing with the denial of status, the loss of lands, and their lives even today. It's not being told. And more people need to hear this story.
Again, going back to this idea that people say, and I've heard it many times, it was a long time ago, get over it. Well, no, this is an obligation that we're carrying from our ancestors. We are the survivors. The hell that our ancestors went through to get us to today deserves the kind of work that we're putting in today. Every day when my wife and I look at our kids, we realize how fortunate it is that our grandparents survived to get us to today.
What are our angles? What can we do? And of course, there was the thing that we've all gone through. The federal recognition process, which was pretty skewed, and we went through it successfully, only to have it overturned. Then there was the thought of a lawsuit. Like I said, the Samish tribe, they cleared the path. It looked like a lawsuit would be a good way to go, but we're a poor tribe. We don't have a lot of revenue.
So what we're really doing is we are sending a letter a day to the president with supporting documentation regarding our history, our fight for recognition, our previous work with any number of agencies of the federal government, treaties, court cases. We're putting everything that we think's important in a letter each and every day. The letter that we're sending daily goes to the president, but the letter we're sending daily goes to 100 media outlets each and every day. We're seeing right now the kind of momentum growing that we'd really hoped to see. It's taken to 80 some days in to really see it growing, but all of a sudden we've got media reaching out to us, wanting to do the in-depth reporting, wanting to tell this story.
Seattle's really an amazing place to ask some of these questions because it's one of the few cities in North America really that sells itself on the image of Native peoples.
Judge Kuhnauer had reversed the denial decision that the BIA made with respect to the Duwamish. That's probably one of the very few times that's ever happened. He found that the failure to consider the 1994 rules when the decision was made was arbitrary and capricious. We have been waiting for the BIA to respond to that remand order, and they did this summer. In the same week, the first week of July, the BIA came out with a new set of recognition rules. Those recognition rules were based on the BIA's understanding that even the 1994 rules were not fair to tribes that were seeking recognition. Yet, in the same week, the BIA came out with these new 2015 rules. They denied the Duwamish. We found it remarkable, amazing, that in the same week that the new rules came out, that the Duwamish were denied recognition under the soon-to-be outdated rules.
And of all the tribes I've worked with in the last 40 years, which was Samish and Snoqualmie and Snohomish and the Colots and the Chinook, and some of these tribes got recognized. And here we are, if you look at the Fornelli Treaty, we're the first signers of the Fornelli Treaty. And we're still fighting since we signed that treaty in 1855. There's something wrong here. There's something wrong here.
The Duwamish would be the only tribe not to get the benefit of the new rules. They designed the two so that in their minds the new rules would not take effect until after the denial of this recognition, and somehow concluded that because this was a remand, that the Duwamish were not entitled to the benefits that all the other pending applications got of the 2015 rules.
I used to race motorcycles, and I've got lots of scars, I've got lots of broken bones, and all of that pales compared to the pain that's felt when the BIA said, oh, by the way, you're not recognized. So it's not just something that happens here today. It's not just us here today. It's all of the people that came before us. It's all of the people that are coming after us. The pain is concentrated from all of those down to this present time. So it hurts a whole lot more than a simple cut or gash or broken bone.
You can't really make a fair decision about recognition without understanding the life of the tribe for the last 20, 25 years. What a tribe is doing at the time that the decision is being made is highly important. What is their role in the community? What's the political role of the tribe? All those are really important considerations, and yet the Duwamish were not given that opportunity. They have a longhouse now along the shores of the Duwamish River in their ancestral homelands. It's been a focal point for all kinds of activities, and yet, as far as the BIA is concerned, that doesn't exist. The BIA also continues to take the position that the Duwamish tribe today is what they call a claims organization. In 1925, this tribe formed a legal entity under the sort of laws of the state of Washington. They filed suit. They were fighting to pursue their treaty rights just as they are now. The courts of the United States recognized the Duwamish tribe as a party who could bring claims for breach of those contractual promises. And they received a judgment, a pitifully small judgment. But all of that says to me that the Duwamish tribe that exists today is legally recognized as the organization that signed a treaty with the United States, and that their consistent effort has been to see that the promises of that treaty were fulfilled.
Our next step for the Duwamish is to have court action. And so our attorneys are working on that. These are important decisions that have to be made.
Here, is a tribe that signed a treaty with the United States. They didn't bargain for the bureaucracy of the BIA. They signed a treaty with specific promises, and the United States courts have said, those promises weren't kept. When the courts of the United States recognized the tribe post 1925 as a party, that's to us a recognition of the tribe.
With the Duwamish, they signed their treaty, got put on a reservation, said they'd be taken care of, starved for a year, and decided they were going to move back into their own area, Chinook, you know, we moved off into the Willapa Bay, you know, and we're going to honor our treaty. And of course, they didn't give us anything that they said they were going to either. I think, you know, when people look at tribes and they look at they always think that they're all different and so forth. But, you know, with the Duwamish and the Chinook, you know, in our story and the recent history, you know, going through our, going through federal recognition, getting it pulled away, and then having to decide what to do. You know, I mean, our stories are so much alike, you know, and it's good that folks see that, you know, two tribes are being treated this way, especially in the Northwest.
And so they're all still here. All the ancestors are still here in spite of all the industry that you see here behind us. The river still flows, the people are still here, and the air still smells good. It's a good day.
We are here right now. We've been here, and we're going to be here, but it's really a matter of respect.
I think that if we are restored, I think that I have done my job. I hope that this will be a stepping stone for all tribes, not only the Duwamish, the people inside, but for all tribes who struggle trying to prove who they are.
And I've heard it said that a single arrow can be broken quite easily. But if you took 550 arrows and bound them together as all the federally recognized tribes supporting each other, it'd be awfully hard to break the strength of all those people working together. So yes, my cousin Cecile, you know, I agree with her totally.
I'm not speaking from my own point of view. I'm telling you what, you know, and I'll name the people. Satuanuk said to me, you know, I'm telling you what Hakum said to me. Whoever it is, the elders that were very influential people in our lives. You know, I want their words and their ideas to carry forward and be what carries the community forward.
But that's, to me, it's all about choice. So do we choose to help our people?
And I just hope and pray that God, the Creator, would allow us to have recognition.
I do suffer from a terminal disease. I've known this for years. I choose to ignore it to the best of my ability because every day I have here is a blessing. Every day I have here allows me to do something more for someone else.
If you know something is right and you know something is wrong and you allow the wrong to be perpetuated and you don't restore the right, then you're culpable. And we have an opportunity, subtle and small on the grand scheme of things, but profoundly important to the people whose lives have been affected and to their ancestors and to our future. Do we want to be the kind of country that says something really wrong was done a long time ago, something very fundamentally unjust, and we knew it? Now, at the time, times were different, but now we know it. And at virtually no cost and no sacrifice, we can set something right that was done wrong, but we're not going to. That doesn't speak very well of us if that's the choice we take. The average citizen can join in that and draft letters. Please do the right thing for the good of this country. And what a great opportunity that is for our elected officials to say, at long last, we've corrected a wrong. We don't get to do that very often in life, to look at a historical wrong and be part of setting that right. And each individual who wants to participate in that can do so. And it may take a while, it may take a lot of voices, but time matters, and if people stay with it, eventually, the great thing about our republic is that people will listen, but only if voices are raised.
It is important to understand this is the land our Creator gave us and promised us. And it is our responsibility to make sure that we can walk with our heads held high upon it.
It's really hard to think that, you know, for this many generations, we're still positive about it, but we are. It is the righteous fight. And as far as my family is concerned, or any of the tribal members, you can't have a better righteous fight. So we continue that fight.
I do not need the federal government to tell me who I am. I do not need them to tell me where I came from. I do not need them to tell me what my culture is, where my family comes from, where we need to go. And I don't even really want to hear it from them. But what I do need from them is that piece of paper that they should have signed and taken care of in 1851 that would have allowed our people to be provided for all these years. So to me, personally, if they want to say they're sorry, take care of our people.
Promised Land. Thanks to everyone who are here with us tonight, who's here with us tonight in the Columbia City Theater. And thanks to all of you online who are sharing with us the both celebration and sadness of having watched Promised Land. This is a film that is both heartbreaking, but fiercely hopeful and determined to rise. And the Chinook and the Duwamish tribes may be heartbroken, but remain fiercely together. Great. In other ways, determined to end all odds. Here with us tonight are three fierce and powerful and hopeful women who are the tribal council leaders, 3 of 11 of the Duwamish tribe. And I am going to ask just a few questions for reflection from Desiree Fagan, Councilwoman Desiree Fagan here, and Councilwoman Yvette Parentes, and Councilwoman Veronica Ramirez. And similar to kind of a film festival style, we're just going to have kind of an informal reflection of during this post-film discussion. And tonight I want to ask each of you just some of your immediate feelings of how you feel after watching this very powerful documentary about your tribe, your people, your ancestors.
Well, I will say that, we are, I do what I do really to honor my ancestors and everyone before me who has always been fighting for our federal recognition. And, I hope that by myself setting that example, that the next generation, my children who are here with us tonight, I hope that they, as I drag them along to all these events that we go to, I really hope that they, it's planting seeds for their future and they can continue the fight for the Duwamish.
Thank you.
I think that really stood to me in the documentary was with my cousin Cecile. It resonated, it ignited something that we all have in us. We have that matriarchal blood in us. And it woke that, because in so many ways that was so symbolic, her standing in front of that bulldozer, because we're still standing in front of that bulldozer. I think what the difference is now is that we're not standing in front of that bulldozer alone. And so that's what the true definition of stand with the Duwamish was Cecile was that only woman standing in front of that bulldozer, but now you have all of us here supporting her and our ancestors. You don't see them, but they're here. They're on our sides, they're in the front, and they're back of us. So that ignited something in me, and it solidified why I'm here.
I guess I would say seeing the film is very emotional. It really strikes a chord with all Duwamish tribal members. I guess the title of the film is it's to the government to keep its promise, and that's what we need and that's what we want. So,
thank you. So many people don't really understand the difference between recognized and unrecognized tribes. And I think the film did a really good job of essentially demonstrating this sort of external, contrived legalization of defining a people's identity and justifying the violence that and the Chinook people and other people world over have had experience. And so when we think about the over 150-year fight for federal recognition, for a legal definition to actually recognize that the federal government, the United States government, needs to uphold its promise that it said it would fulfill in terms of land, in terms of fundamental rights to practice your culture, in terms of resources and other support for tribes like yours. It also means, as I've been involved with the tribe, a full exercise and restoration of your sovereignty as a people. But fundamentally, each of you personally, what does sovereignty mean for you? And I know that each of you is already involved in the leadership of the Tribal Council for the Duwamish. I know that each of you are involved in different programs like culture and art and education and language. But on a personal level, what does sovereignty for you?
For me, it means for us being able to stand alone. Housing security, educational security, food security, self-governing, us being able to be off the grid if we choose to, being able to source our food through our natural ways by fishing our rights, being able to harvest without needing to have a federally recognized card, so being able to practice our cultural ways, that's sovereign. Being able to live indigenously.
I think sovereignty means a lot of different people. And I think for me, I grew up in the dance group Talib Shut Up, which translates to singing feet. That was my culture and my sovereignty growing up. So being on the council is very important to me, and we practice that and promote that as leaders of the Duwamish Tribal Nation, and making sure that what I saw growing up is continuing, is our culture. So that's what that means to me.
For me, sovereignty, that's an interesting word. You know, we're not able to be in our sovereignty because we are denied. But today we are continuing to practice our sovereignty. Is just a couple weeks ago at the Longhouse, I helped to teach and facilitate a drum making workshop. And we had our tribal members come and we made hand drums, you know, and I helped to teach that. And for me, that's continuing our traditions and our culture, which is vital because we've had to fight, and fight and fight. And just helping to teach meaning Duwamish that we even have that we have a Longhouse, to have a roof over our head, for our people to gather, us to have a simple class like that and continue those teachings to the next generation is very powerful for me.
Thank you. You know, I think the power of film, like Promised Land, actually helps to educate people in so many ways. It allows people to see and hear and feel and try and experience a level of empathy that the Duwamish tribe and you as women leaders here of the maternal tribe of Chief Seattle have had to endure against all odds. But in many ways as well, what so many people in this city have seen is the rise of the tribe. And a hopeful level, for example, has really kind of anointed you all as the people's tribe. That no matter what it is that the federal government is still waiting on and deliberating, our federal lawsuit filed in May, of the Duwamish tribe and the people of Seattle are saying the time is now. And so if there were to be a sequel, what might you also want to have in that sequel, specific or general to this Promised Land documentary?
For me, I would hope that if there was a Promised Land sequel, that it would be really documenting the people who have, the Duwamish who have stuck along the way, along with the Chinook, who have continued to fight to keep their culture alive through generations and generations, to continue the traditions and culture, no matter with federal recognition. We have a happy ending. That would be wonderful.
Ideally, the sequel, would be post acknowledgement, right, of restoring our acknowledgement. However, if there were a sequel, I would definitely want it to go and tell and follow certain families and families of the Duwamish and how they suffered. What was the direct impact of not being recognized and not having a reservation, being vulnerable, the lack of educational opportunities. I would want to dive a little bit more into that as well. Also speak about some other bulldozers and us not being at the table, speak about the intertribal battles, that genocide and ethnocide that's continuing with Tulalip, that's continuing with Suquamish, that are our relatives as well, right? Muckleshoot. So I definitely want to dive into that a little bit more.
I guess what I would say would, what really resonated with me during the film was the former chairman of the Chinook saying, one arrow can break, but we need more arrows in this bundle and more support from different tribes. Where we are. And I think the equal is more crucial for our community. Not just for recognized tribes, but unrecognized as well.
Councilwoman Veronica Ramirez, I just wanted to actually say that in light of those comments, what's very exciting that the public should know is an upcoming gathering of unrecognized tribes hosted by the Duwamish Tribe later this month. I think that is just the beginning of the demonstration of the benevolence and the kind of different and hopeful leadership that the Duwamish Tribe is demonstrating across the nation, across the world, of what it means to actually amplify and to really recognize. And so in light of the well over 200, close to 300 federally unrecognized tribes across the United States, the Duwamish Tribe wishes to extend the fact that a real rent movement has gathered and growing to actually support our efforts in federal recognition. And so I think that with Gary with me is that with so many arrows, we actually can be stronger and make things different. I want to ask, maybe somebody could get that red little booklet. This is something interesting to end on. And if you could just hand it to me, because it is probably the only copy that we have from the archives of the Duwamish Tribe. And this is from what it reads as Washington's Landless Tribes. I'm not sure if the camera for our online viewers can see this, but it reads Washington's Landless Tribes, Our Quest for Federal Tribal Recognition. It was actually produced by the Small Tribes of Western Washington, which Tribal Council Chair Cecile Hansen had actually led for a number of years, and together with her brothers and sisters went to Congress and to the executive office to advocate on behalf of the 6 tribes who are listed in here. And the interesting thing here, as I've shared with the Tribal Council, is that we have the Snohomish Tribe, which remains unrecognized. And it provides a profile and shared with Congress people the story of that Duwamish Tribe, which remain recognized. The Steilacoom Tribe, which remains unrecognized. The Chinook Tribe, which remains unrecognized. The Samish Indian Tribe, which is now recognized. The Snoqualmie Tribe, which is now recognized. And the Cowlitz Tribe, which is now recognized. And so here we are, we're halfway there. So I want to actually end on that full note where our ancestors ask all of you to learn more Amish tribe, the Chinook tribe, and so many other unrecognized tribes that are waiting for justice across the country. Thanks. All right, that's a wrap.